Welcome back to the Untold Stories, exclusive before Start the Story Now. Subscribe to the channel and comment down where you're from and what time it is for you right now. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and let the darkness speak. In the low valleys of western North Carolina, where the mountains fold upon themselves like tired giants, there lies a place once called Black Hollow. Today it exists only as a name on faded railway ledgers, a ghost of a town swallowed by forest and silence. But in the autumn of 1902, it was a living, breathing place filled with the smoke of coal fires, the ring of hammers, and the weary rhythm of pickaxes echoing from the mine shafts that tunneled beneath the earth. Black Hollow was not much to look at. A single dirt road wound through its heart, slick with mud and ruts deep, enough to swallow wagon wheels. The general store leaned on its foundation as though half asleep. The church stood crooked, its steeple bent from a lightning strike years before. The people who lived there were miners, farmers, widows, and orphans, men who rose before dawn, women who buried their grief in sewing and prayer, and children who ran barefoot through dust that smelled faintly of iron and rain. The land itself had a weight to it, a kind of heaviness that pressed down on every living thing. The mountains to the west were dark with hemlock and oak, their shadows crawling over the town by afternoon. To the east stretched a shallow river, sluggish and brown, which the locals called the Whistler because, on windy nights, its current made a keening sound that rose through the valley like someone crying for help. People said that Black Hollow was cursed long before the storm. They said the ground had been bought cheap because it was once a burial place for an old settlement, a community washed away by fever in 1849. Miners still found bones when they dug too deep. No one spoke of it openly, not in church, not at supper, but they all knew. Some places, it seems, are born with sorrow stitched into the soil. And into that sorrow came Dr. Elias Wren. He arrived in the spring of 1891, stepping down from the Carolina train with a single trunk and a leather satchel. He was tall, narrow in the shoulders, and always dressed in black. His beard was short and neat, his eyes pale gray, like smoke from a dying fire. He spoke softly, with the rhythm of a man who measured every word before letting it go. At first, the townsfolk were glad to have him. Before Wren, the nearest physician was nearly 40 miles away, and the sick often had to be carried by wagon for hours along washed-out roads. The people of Black Hollow welcomed him with cautious gratitude. His home sat on the northern edge of town, a square, two-story house of warped clapboard, its roof patched with tin, a narrow porch wrapped around it, where bottles of colored glass hung on strings, clinking when the wind blew. Inside, the air smelled of camphor and linseed oil, and shelves lined with jars of strange things, dried roots, coiled snakes in cloudy liquid, and small bones labeled in spidery handwriting. To those who entered, it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Elias Wren was a man of habits. He rose each morning before the church bell and walked the same path through town, stopping first at the post office to collect letters, then at the store to buy supplies. He never lingered for talk. At noon, he ate exactly one slice of bread and a piece of salted pork. By sunset, he would light the lamps in his study and write in his ledger, a heavy black book bound in worn leather, its corners reinforced with brass. He recorded everything: the names of patients, their symptoms, the dates of visits, and their outcomes. Some said he even noted the time of death down to the minute. In those years before the storm, nothing about him seemed unusual beyond his solitude. He was diligent, sober, and efficient. But if you watched closely, if you saw him pass beneath the gaslight at night, you might have noticed how often he glanced over his shoulder, as though something walked a few steps behind him. As the years passed, the town grew around its sorrows. In 1896, the mine collapsed, killing 19 men. In 1899, Fever swept through the valley, taking 32 souls. Each time Dr. Wren worked tirelessly, his ledger filling with names. And yet, as tragedy deepened, so too did his strangeness. He no longer attended church. He stopped tipping his hat to the ladies in the street. He stopped answering the door after sunset. Some nights, people saw a lantern moving through the woods behind his house, steady, deliberate, swaying like a pendulum. When asked about it, he said nothing. Then there were the whispers. Children claimed to see figures standing at his window. When he was away, pale faces looking out. UNMOV ING. The undertaker, a man named Hiram Bell, said that the doctor's patients never stayed still in the ground, though he refused to explain what he meant. And once, a midwife swore she saw Dr. Wren burying something small in his garden at midnight. But Black Hollow was a place that kept its secrets. The people needed their doctor, and so long as he came when called, no one dared pry too deeply. By 1901, the storms began to worsen. The summers were dry and cracked, but the autumns came like vengeance. Rain fell for days without end, washing mud into the streets and swelling the Whistler River until it licked at the bridge posts. Each year, someone would drown, and the townsfolk would say it was the river reclaiming what had been taken from it. Dr. Wren's ledger grew heavier with names. His handwriting, once fine and graceful, became cramped and uneven. His neighbors said he no longer looked people in the eye. The only visitor he received regularly was a delivery boy who brought him ink, candles, and more paper. The boy later told the sheriff that Wren's house never seemed dark. Even after midnight, a faint yellow glow always seeped from between the curtains, as though someone inside couldn't stop writing. On the morning of October 31st, 1902, the sky over Black Hollow turned the color of lead. The wind had the taste of metal, sharp and electric. By noon, the first flakes of snow fell, and by evening, the rain came down in sheets that bent the trees sideways. Crows gathered on the rooftops, silent, wings slick with water. The townsfolk boarded their windows, tied their animals, and waited. Dr. Wren was seen that afternoon walking toward town, his coat soaked through, carrying the black ledger under his arm as if it were something alive. He stopped at the post office, spoke a few quiet words to the clerk, and left a sealed envelope addressed to Amos Crane, Sheriff of Black Hollow. Then he turned and walked back toward his house through the storm. No one ever saw him again in daylight. The envelope would not be opened until 2 days later, after the storm had broken and 6 bodies had been found. But that is a story for another act. For now, the ledger waits, its pages empty, ink bottle uncorked, the sound of rain whispering against the shutters. And somewhere, in the dark between lightning and thunder, the doctor dips his pen and begins to write. That night would be remembered by every survivor as the night of the ledger, the storm that changed the valley, and the man who wrote down death before it arrived. In the years that followed, when travelers came through and asked about the ruins on the hill, the locals would only say one thing: don't dig where the river bends. The doctor still keeps count. The storm did not begin as a storm. It began as a whisper, the low hum of pressure before the world breaks. On the morning of November 1st, 1902, the air in Black Hollow hung heavy and wrong, the kind of air that makes dogs bark without reason and sends hens scattering for cover. The miners refused to go underground that day. The barometer at the general store had fallen past its lowest mark, and the sky above the ridge pulsed with an odd green light. By afternoon, the Whistler River had risen nearly to the bridge rails, and by nightfall, thunder rolled over the valley like an approaching army. At Dr. Wren's house, the lamps burned bright. A neighbor, Mrs. Clemency Dyer, who lived across the field, later said that she saw him through her window standing perfectly still in his study, quill poised, head bowed. He remained that way for nearly an hour, she claimed, as though waiting for something unseen to give permission. Then, At precisely 9:06 p.m., he began to write. The ledger still survives, preserved today in the Caldwell County Historical Archive. Its pages warped but legible. Page 312 begins with that date, November the 1st, 1902. Beneath it, the ink is darker, the handwriting more hurried than usual. Sarah Phelps, age 9, severe fever. Condition: expired. Jonas Harker, minor. Rib fracture, internal bleeding. Expired. Martha Cole, widow. Head trauma, expired. Each name matched a real person who lived in the town. Each one was found dead the next morning. And yet the handwriting proved the entries were written hours before the deaths occurred. The coroner, years later, would testify that Sarah Phelps drowned after the roof of her home collapsed in the storm. Jonas Harker was crushed by a falling beam in the mine. Martha Cole died when her chimney fell inward. The times of death were between midnight and dawn. The ink, however, was dry before 10 p.m. No one could explain it. Mrs. Dyer said she saw Wren leave his house sometime after 10 o'clock, his coat whipping in the wind, his lantern flickering weakly against the rain. He walked toward town, his black book pressed against his chest. Behind him, the light in his study remained burning, unmoving, as though someone still stood inside. Somewhere near the bridge, he stopped. Two boys, Matthew and Paul Brewer, hiding beneath their father's wagon, saw him kneel by the riverbank. They said he spoke softly, not to himself, but to something below the water. Then he dipped his hand into the river and touched the ledger's spine to the surface. When he stood again, the water had turned black. By morning, 6 were dead, and the ledger, when found days later, contained their names written before the storm had even reached its height. But that night did not end with death alone. Something else moved through the valley, something quieter and far older than the town itself. In the following days, survivors began to report strange occurrences. Milk turned sour overnight, even in sealed jars. Iron tools rusted within hours. The church bell rang once, always at 10:17 p.m., though no one pulled the rope. And when the sheriff, Amos Crane, came to question the townsfolk, they all repeated the same phrase in frightened tones. The doctor's still making his rounds. They said they saw his lantern at night, bobbing along the riverbank, drifting between the trees, though his house was empty and his body never found. Sometimes it appeared in 2 places at once, seen from the mill and from the churchyard in the same hour. The light would pause, flicker twice, then vanish, leaving behind the faint scent of camphor and burnt sugar. 3 days after the storm, the sheriff opened the letter Wren had left behind at the post office. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were legible. It read, "To Sheriff Amos Crane, Black Hollow. By the time you read this, the names will be written. You will not find me among the living, though my duty remains unfinished. Keep the ledger sealed until the 7th day, for the dead do not rest until their accounts are balanced. If the bell rings after the rain, do not answer the door." E.W. Crane folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. That night, the bell rang once more 3 times at exactly 10:17, and though he tried to ignore it, he swore later that he heard footsteps on his porch, slow and deliberate, followed by the faint rustle of paper beneath his door. When he opened it, there was nothing, only wet footprints leading away into the mud. The next morning, his name appeared in the ledger, written neatly between the entries for Hiram Bell, the undertaker, and Clement Dyer, the widow's son. His condition: expired. But the sheriff was still alive. For the next 48 hours, he carried the ledger with him, terrified to open it again. When he finally did, he found his own handwriting in the margins, words he did not remember writing. Notes about the storm, about the bodies, about the doctor's final movements. He burned the pages, but each morning, new notes appeared in the same hand. By the end of the week, Crane stopped sleeping. He locked himself in his office, muttering that the doctor's ink had memory. Witnesses say that he kept dipping and invisible pen into an empty bottle, scrawling on the walls until his fingers bled. When they found him on November 8th, he was seated at his desk, eyes open. UNMOVING. The ledger lay before him, and across the bottom of the final page, in black ink, was written a single sentence: balance restored. But it wasn't, because even after Crane's burial, the bell continued to ring. And more names began to appear in the book, people still living, written with the same hand, the same careful script. No one could destroy it. When they tried to burn it, the flames refused to touch the paper. When they buried it, the ground turned soft and pushed it back up overnight. Eventually, the townsfolk locked it in the church cellar, sealed in a wooden box, and swore to never open it again. Years passed. The mine closed. Families moved away. By 1910, Black Hollow was a ruin, roofs caved in, fields overgrown, the river eating away the road. Only the church remained, its bell tower leaning against the sky. And yet, each November, someone claimed to hear the bell, always 3 times, always at 10:17. And if you stood close enough, they said you could see the light of a lantern moving through the fog by the river, slow and patient, as though searching for another name to write. What no one knew then was that the ledger had not been written only once. Between its pages, other entries appeared, older handwriting, faded and cracked, dated long before Wren's time, names of people who never lived in Black Hollow at all. Some from Tennessee, some from Virginia, one from as far north as Ohio. And beneath those names, always the same single word: expired. The ink was not Wren's. It belonged to his father. Dr. Silas Wren, a man who died in 1884 after a similar storm took an entire mining camp near the Blue Ridge Pass. Reports from that era mention strange writings found in his cabin, lists of names written before a cave-in that killed 63 men. The handwriting matched Elias's exactly. It was said that both men, father and son, believed in a terrible duty, that death did not come of its own accord, but needed to be recorded to cross the veil, that when the name was written, the soul could be taken cleanly. And if the name was forgotten, the dead would walk. Whether Elias inherited his father's curse or created his own, no one can say. But on that night in 1902, as the storm tore through Black Hollow, something was set in motion that has never been undone. When the archivists in Raleigh examined the ledger decades later, they found fingerprints pressed into the paper, faint, oily, and human, belonging to at least 7 different individuals. Yet none of those people had ever been in possession of the book. Some had died years before its creation. And the ink, under ultraviolet light, was found to contain traces of hemoglobin. Real blood. The townsfolk who remained called it the doctor's curse. But the few who knew him in life said Elias Wren was not cursed, he was compelled, that he didn't summon the dead. He merely answered them, because long before that storm, before the church and the mine and the dying, Elias Wren had been heard, whispering to himself in the streets, reciting names no one recognized, pausing sometimes mid-word as though listening to someone call them back to him from the other side of the rain. By the second week after the storm, Black Hollow had lost more than half its people, not to flood or fever, but to fear. Those who stayed kept candles burning at their windows, believing the light would keep the doctor away. But the light only seemed to draw him closer. And one by one, the candles went out. When the last family fled in December, they left behind a single house still lit, the Wren home, its upper windows glowing faintly through the fog, as though someone inside continued to write. And if you stood in the rain that winter, you could hear it, the faint scrape of a quill on paper, steady and unbroken, marking time. Thus ended the first wave of the storm's aftermath, not with the doctor's death, but with his absence. The town decayed, the living left, and all that remained was the book. Waiting, breathing, and far from Black Hollow, across the mountains and rivers, new names began to disappear from parish records, always written in the same gray hand. The storm took much from Black Hollow, but time took more. What the river did not drown, exile erased. Names thinned in ledgers. Houses fell to seed. Footpaths vanished into thickets of briar and switchgrass. And yet, despite the ruin, a single object persisted as if immune to weather and rot. The black book with brass-cornered covers, insistent as a heartbeat. Not all archives are housed in marble rooms. Some are kept in basements where the floor sweats in summer and the shelves tilt with age. In such a place, in a courthouse 2 counties east, a retired clerk with a taste for order gathered what remained of Black Hollow: tax rolls, death notices, a stack of damp letters tied with twine, and wrapped in oiled cloth, the ledger that would not burn. He did not catalog it properly. He simply wrote "Ren do not destroy" on a scrap and jammed it into the spine like a warning. Years later, when the town had turned to rumor, an itinerant archivist traced the rumor back to the shelf and opened the cloth. The air that came out of the bundle was cold and faintly sweet, like lily left too long in a chapel. The brass corners were tarnished to a sickly green. The leather bore scratches that resembled fingernail marks, too narrow and frantic to be tools. The book gave beneath the hand like breathing wood. Within those covers, the entries from November 1902 were not the first, only the most precise. They had a confidence the earlier lines lacked. In the initial pages, some dated 1879 and 1883, the handwriting wandered, as if the writer were arguing with himself, or with something no reader could see. Names bent across the line. The ink pooled and thinned, a tide moving through words. By 1884, the hand became a mirror of the sun's. The same narrow letters, the same tight loops, the same habit of crossing a T with 2 strikes when the name belonged to a child. The father taught the son more than medicine. Among the courthouse papers lay the first scaffolding of an explanation. It began not with Elias but with Dr. Silas Wren, whose practice strayed along mining camps and sawmills in the Blue Ridge, wherever men broke themselves against timber and stone. Silas wrote almost nothing about his own life except in margins. In those traces, the archivist found a map of grief. A wife buried young. A son left at a sister's in Richmond. A series of storms that seemed to follow his work like a debt collector who knew the route better than the debtor. The storms brought drownings, collapses, the sudden infections that turned the skin glassy and the eyes dull. Silas took their names down as if listing ingredients for a cure. Elsewhere in the box, a ledger fragment appeared, 2 leaves blackened along their edges, torn from a different book entirely. The paper had a varnished sheen, like something lacquered to keep out air. On those leaves, written in a cramped, dutiful hand, was an accounting that had nothing to do with medicine. Columns of dates, initials, an occasional place name. Each line ended with a mark that looked like a hook. The archivist recognized it only after counting. Every 7th mark darkened almost to a bruise. A rhythm then. An interval. A rule dot. It seemed at first like superstition, an old mountain numerology. But the courthouse files added a further piece, the kind that does not announce itself, only waits until the light falls the right way across the page. A docket from August 1884 recorded an inquiry into a cave-in at the Blue Ridge Pass Run. 63 dead. The mine foreman 1 G. Haldane gave a statement that reads like arithmetic done with grief for chalk. He listed the dead by crew, by shaft, by ticket. The total rose and rose, then paused at 62. Haldane scratched, counted again, and revised to 63. The docket's final line bore a clerk's note. Dr. Wren arrived on site the night prior. He delivered a list of emergency supplies and a roster of names to be kept ready for coroner. Roster included the 63 later identified. The date on the roster, the night before the collapse. It is possible to misread. The archivist tried to. He looked for the trick of it. Confusion, coincidence, a clerk's careless hand. But the old paper does not care what the living prefer. The paper tells what it was made to hold. Wren's list anticipated the dead. If Silas anticipated the dead, then Elias perfected the practice. The Sun's ledger devoted a chapter to the rites of preparation, a phrase too ornate for a practical country doctor. The pages were marred by water, or by some thinner solvent that bled ink into a gray veil. Through that veil, the archivist could still discern the structure, name, affliction, whether obvious or unknown, hour, a small symbol drawn like a knot between two slanted lines. The symbol repeated whenever the death was distant by more than a day. If the hour of writing and the hour of death lay closer, the knot darkened. The knot resembles the hook in Silas's torn leaves. The family did not invent a symbol. It inherited one. Not all evidence sleeps neatly in files. Some loiters where a town has been, in the open air, wearing moss. The archivist went to the ruins of Black Hollow with a notebook and a reluctance that felt almost like superstition wearing a suit. The church still leaned against sky and wind, its bell gone. The floor had given way to ferns. The cemetery remained, stones tilted like teeth in old gums. On a rise beyond the fence, hemmed by 3 black pines, lay a small square of ground bounded in fieldstone, too regular to be random. A family plot, perhaps. Perhaps a garden. The stones formed an uneven rectangle, as if placed in haste, or replaced over and over when something beneath pushed to breathe. In that square, the archivist found glass. Not a bottle, not a window pane, but beads not quite beads either. They were more like the necks of vials, smoothed by weather, threaded once with wire or cord. They bore grime that would not yield to the thumb. When he lifted one to his eye, the world narrowed to a circle and darkened, as if the glass remembered lamplight only. On the dirt beside the beads lay the corroded hinge of a small box, and an inch away, a nail bent into a crude fish shape. Not talisman enough to hold back a river, perhaps talisman enough to bind a book. The archivist recorded what he could measure, the dimensions of the plot, the number and color of the beads, the way the soil gave more easily than the rest of the hillside. He did not dig. The mountain is patient with fools until it ISN single quotes T. Back in the courthouse. He read the last intact testimony from those days when fear ate meals with the living. A schoolmaster from a neighboring town wrote in a ledger of his own that he had hosted Elias as a boy after the death of the boy's mother. He recalled a child who loved anatomy texts as other boys love maps or toy soldiers. He described a game. The boy would pick a page at random and run his finger down the list of bones, whispering each in order until the rhythm pleased him. He did not stop at the bones. He memorized the names of plants that purify willow, yarrow, pennyroyal, and of those that poison nightshade. Foxglove, the wrong mushroom with the right cap. The schoolmaster said the boy's favorite book was a treatise on mortality and its rituals, copied from an older work that had passed from hand to hand like a candle guttering to a wick. The boy loved the Latin for its chill. Mortuarium, an accounting of the dead. Not a lament, not a prayer in accounting. Even as a child, Elias sought not to grieve the dead but to enumerate them. The archivist understood then that the ledger was not a diary. Diaries plead with the future to remember a voice. The ledger had no interest in being heard. It was a tool. It recorded, and recording itself did the work. On several pages, beside the final entry of the day, a stamp-like bloom appeared, ink that had bled out and then retracted, leaving a lip around a pale center. Under magnification, each bloom revealed words so small they hovered at the edge of legibility. The words were, astonishingly, dates that did not correspond to the day of writing. Some were hours away, others by years. One date lay a generation past the fall of Black Hollow. The bloom was a mouth. It whispered forward. The archivist resisted the seductive explanation that the ledger foretold death. Superstition loves a straight line to destiny. But the evidence suggested something subtler and worse. The book did not predict. It arranged. It made a place in the world for each name, like a clerk setting a chair at a table. Once the chair existed, so did the occasion to fill it. Death did not visit. It had an appointment dot in the back of the ledger, where paste-down paper hides the binding. A bit of card had been worked loose. On the card, in the tidy, hesitant print of a man trying to be neat for once in his life, a brief inscription: "If I keep count, they pass clean. If I falter, they knock." The ink was Elias's. The pressure at the tail of the K was heavy enough to scar the board beneath. As though the hand that wrote it had clenched to keep from shaking, another artifact surfaced among the writs. A single, folded sheet that had been used to pad a frame. The sheet was once a letter and had aged out of its envelope and into anonymity. It began with a place name that no longer exists and ended with a name that still does. Between lay a litany, ledger, given at 13, taught to listen at 15. First winter of names at 16. The rule of 7 kept. The bell keeps the hour. This was not confession. It was procedure. It had the cold logic of a medical chart. To read it was to feel a small portion of the compulsion that held the wren. Line by the throat, the way a rule convinces the mind that obedience is mercy. The archivist arranged his finds on a table the way coroners arrange the effects of the unclaimed. Tags, strings, plates of glass, the hinge, the bent nail, the torn leaves with the hooked marks, the ledger that lay like a closed mouth. He did not know yet the full shape of what he had gathered. He knew only that the pattern moved beyond persons to practice, beyond coincidence to craft. The Wren men had not stumbled into a haunting. They had apprenticed in it. He closed the book at dusk. The window reflected his face, paler than he remembered, and somewhere, down the corridor, a clock responded to the hour with 3 indifferent beats. The sound traveled into the room and fell upon the table like gray dust. Beyond the courthouse walls, the mountain breathed as it has always breathed, slow, deep cold at the edges. In that breath, paper curls and uncurls by itself. Bindings yawn and settle. Ink finds its level. By full dark, the room returned to its own order: the glass, the hinge. The nail and the book seemed to sit a little nearer to the edge than he had left it, as if the table had leaned, or the leather had crept under its own will toward the drop, the revelation. Then, the ledger was not merely a record of death. It was a passage, a narrow bridge laid page by page across a black water. The Wren men did not summon the river. They measured it, and in the measuring built the crossing. The names did not drown by chance. They crossed where the bridge lay, and at the margin of that knowledge, the archivist reached for the book again, as if compelled to confirm a line he had not yet read, a bloom he had not yet deciphered. The leather felt warm, or perhaps his hand had chilled. Beneath his thumb, the brass corner twitched like a pulse. He opened to the last blank page and found, there in the bottom right, a stain shaped like a seed. The seed had a date inside it. The date was not from the past. The seed-shaped stain was not ink dot, it shimmered faintly, darker than the rest, as though still wet after decades sealed in paper. The archivist leaned closer. Under the magnifier's lens, the stain resolved into a ring of script letters too small for a sane hand to have written. When he adjusted the light, the letters fell into order. November 12, 1921. 19 years beyond the storm. He knew enough of archives to respect coincidence. But this was not coincidence. No other entry carried a date beyond the author's lifetime, and yet here it was, written in the same gray hand that had marked 1902, the same slant, the same hesitation at the downward stroke of an R. The archivist sat back and let the dark gather. Outside, November rain brushed the courthouse roof. Inside, his breath rose in thin fog. He began to search for what that date could mean, whose death it might foretell or fulfill. The census of Caldwell County for 1921 held one familiar name, Elias Wren, aged 54, listed as missing, presumed deceased. The line had been added in a clerk's steadier script years. After the ledger's last visible entry, someone, perhaps the same sheriff's successor, had attempted to make official what rumor insisted, but the ledger itself refused the closure. It carried on writing after its keeper vanished. He traced the ink around the date with the back of a scalpel blade. The texture felt uneven, like the edge of a scab. Beneath that layer, the paper pulsed with faint warmth. It was then he noticed the indentation on the opposite page. Not writing, but pressure, as if a sheet had once lain between them and been removed. The imprint of words remained, backward and shallow. He rubbed charcoal lightly across the surface. Letters bloomed up in -3 lines only. Ledger must remain open. Every 7th unclaimed shall right themselves. When the hand fails, the name will suffice. He could not tell whether it was a threat or a warning. The phrasing had that mixture of reverence and precision found in both theology and bookkeeping. He returned to the earlier pages. Counting in sevens, every 7th entry was marked with a double cross, and between each cross lay a small variation in ink, lighter, thinner, as if written by another instrument, or another pulse. If he tallied those marks, the pattern reached forward beyond the known dead, as though the book had been pacing the generations waiting to inherit it. He thought of Silas's hook marks, of Elias's knots, of the way storms seemed to come in cycles along that range, every 7 to 9 years. The wind finding the same valley. He thought of his own reflection in the glass case where the ledger would soon return, and how the eyes staring back were ringed like a man who had not slept for days. Sleep came thin, full of arithmetic. He dreamed of lists, of hands blotting names clean with a touch, of water climbing stairs. When he woke, the clock read 3:17, the inverse of the hour the bell once told. The building was silent. He went to the table, meaning only to close the book properly and lock it away. The ledger was already open. The seed mark had spread to a full oval, and within it, a new line of text, archivist, unnamed, record due. He told himself it was the work of moisture, of capillary wicking. But the words stood crisp, their descenders cutting into the fiber. The pen that wrote them had pressed with intent. He felt, absurdly, the need to answer. He dipped his own pen into ink and wrote, beneath the line, a single refusal. No. The ink dried without sinking. A skin formed between it and the paper, refusing union, like oil atop water. He closed the ledger and placed it in its wrapping. But closing did not still it. The silence afterward thickened until each heartbeat sounded foreign, as if echoed by another organ outside the body. He locked the office, left the courthouse, and walked into the cold dawn. The rain had stopped. Mist lay along the street like steam from an unseen wound. For weeks he avoided the record room, working instead on mundane files, deeds, births, marriages. But the habit of order betrayed him. Each register he touched bore, somewhere along its margin, a faint smudge shaped like the hook of Silas's mark. The contagion of notation had begun. He resigned that winter. Before he left, he boxed the ledger, labeled it Private Property of State, and transferred it to Raleigh. He added one last note to the inventory: condition stable, odor faint, do not expose to light. No one could tell later how the box reached the museum basement. Somewhere between counties, the paperwork broke. The box lost its number. Years later, a curator unpacking donations found the ledger and, finding no record, placed it in the collection of unverified provenance. She described the book in her catalog as black leather volume, medical or clerical, anonymous 19th century. She did not mention the smell when she photographed the pages for digital record. The images developed with artifacts, blurred faces, faint letters crowding the margins, exposure ghosts of shapes not present to the lens. The technicians assumed chemical decay. But the anomalies appeared only on every seventh frame. The curator retired in 22:1. In the log of her final day, she noted a maintenance request. Humidity in sub-archive B1 too high. Mold on shelf 7. No one filed the request. On November 12th, the automatic climate sensor recorded a sudden drop in temperature at 10:17 p.m. A single minute of cold so deep it froze condensation to the steel. Door. The timestamp matched the date within the seed mark. The one written a century earlier in blood-tinted ink. No footage survived. Only the data log. A gap where the temperature fell and the humidity vanished. And in the morning, the shelf stood empty, save for the faint print of a rectangle in dust, brass-cornered. Recently lifted. The archivist never returned for his files. His desk remained, his notebooks stacked. His name never recorded in the ledger of state employees that year, yet in the digital index of the museum, where clerks record objects and their handlers. A new field appeared without user entry, cataloged by E-Ren. No system crash. No hack. Just a name that had not been typed since 1902. Restored by an unseen hand to the profession it had never truly left. Thus the revelation completes its circle. The doctor's craft was never buried in black hollow. It merely changed its medium from paper and blood to whatever record-keeping the living invent next. The ledger was always a mirror held up to bureaucracy, to the idea that counting saves. It thrives wherever someone believes a name on a page is safer than a silence unbroken. If you visit Raleigh today, beneath the museum's lowest floor, you may still feel the air grow damp near a locked door labeled B1. Behind it lies a row of shelves, 7 high. The lights flicker, the air hums with static. And on one shelf, the 7th dust refuses to settle. Some nights, a security guard swears he hears the soft rasp of paper turning by itself. He says it sounds not unlike breathing, and when he counts the rhythm, it comes in 7s. Nights like that do not arrive all at once. They accrete. Small warnings gather in doorframes and eaves. Hinges stiffen. Lamps burn dirtier. The dog that never minds the weather insists on the hearth, eyes fixed on a door that does not yet knock. On November 1st, 1902, the valley turned inward before dusk. The ridge held the last light like a cup and poured it out in a thin spill over the river. The whistler rose to the bracing on the bridge, touched iron, and sang. In the fields, the cane bowed to something coming. The crows found the school roof and faced one way, as if a wind only they felt pressed their throats to silence. In the doctor's house, the study window breathed a pale rectangle into the dark. The room smelled of camphor and boiled linens and the iron shadow of a wet stove. The ledger lay centered on the desk, squared to the edge, a black square waiting to be opened. The blotter beneath was already stained in rings, a topography of other storms. 7 o'clock. The church caretaker, Ephraim Lott, wrote a note in the vestry book. Barometer no longer credible. Sound of bell rope thrumming without hand to it. He folded the note into the pages and slid the book into a drawer. The drawer refused to close fully. Something swollen in the wood. He left it that way, a finger's width of night showing through. Back at the house, the doctor checked his instruments with the calm of a man laying out bandages. The lancet. The stethoscope, cold as coin. The quill trimmed to a thin, stubborn point. He drew black ink into the barrel and set the bottle by his right hand. He peeled away a square of oiled cloth from a narrow vial and raised it to the light. The liquid inside clung to the glass like something that remembered a body. He set it down without using it. A decision deferred a minute more. 7-30. The wind found the gaps under doors. It spoke in the key of the old floorboards. The first of the traveling shutters banged once on the undertaker's house and did not bang again. Hiram Bell, that careful man, set a chair against the door and sat, hat on his knee. As if waiting in his own parlor for guests late to an appointment, the doctor opened the ledger. The leather flexed, then yielded. The first page of the night lay blank as a sheet on a narrow bed. He drew his hands to the table, palms down. He rested them there as a penitent rests a brow on the rail. Then he lifted the quill and wrote the date. The line steadied the air. Outside, the Whistler left its banks, 8 o'clock. Rain went through nail holes and into shingles that had not leaked since the last century. The schoolhouse chalk sweated white onto the slate. The general store took in its sign and found, beneath the bracket where the sign had hung for a decade, a clean square of board, pale as unfinished bone. By 8:15, the storm came ashore in the street. It moved like a body through a crowd. It shouldered against fences and windows, tested hinges, learned the town's length by touch. The church door bowed and then held. The old stairs at the post office gave, not with a sound of breaking, but with a sigh, as if a man rose after an ill night and agreed to lie down again. In the study, the first name found the page. He did not look out the window to confirm. He did not stand. He did not listen for a knock that would have been polite. He wrote, Sarah Phelps, age 9. He wrote fever, though the roof had not yet fallen, though the creek had not yet climbed her front steps. He wrote expired, though she still held her doll and counted the seconds between lightning and thunder to see whether the storm was coming closer or going away. The word pinned the hour to a table. The hour would not rise again. He left a space after Sarah's line. He drew the knot, the small symbol between the slanted strokes. The knot darkened. He shook his hand once to throw the ache out of the wrist and wrote the next name. 8-40. The lightning did not fork. It sheeted. The ridgeline became a white bone and then forgot itself. A team of mules broke their halter and ran. But the road had turned to a mouthful of black teeth, and the animals, unwilling to swallow, wheeled and pressed their foreheads to a church wall as if waiting for a hand to bless them. The lamp on the doctor's desk breathed small. Smoke from the wick laid a fine black hair along the chimney. He turned the screw. The flame grew steady again. He set the quill down, flexed his fingers, and listened. Not to the storm. To the ledger. To the pressure in the spine where the gatherings nested. To the slight swelling where the paper had learned the rain's shape and remembered. Then he lifted the quill and wrote Jonas Harker. He wrote ribs, internal, the medical words like narrow bridges across a wide water. He did not write prayer. He did not write please. He wrote expired. 9 o'clock. The sheriff stepped onto his porch and found the world arranged into blades. Rain fell in long lines, straight enough to cut. He thought of crossing to the jail, then thought better. He stood a moment longer, listening to a sound that came from no one street, no one roof. A sound that came from under the ground, a low, wet rolling like a barrel filled and turned by a patient hand. Water remade the tunnels beneath their feet. He mouthed a number without meaning to. 7. In the study, the doctor paused to blot. The blotter drank. The blotter could drink the whole night and never sicken. He touched the vial. He did not unstop it. He closed his eyes and saw the seam where the book's paste down hid the binding. He thought of the bit of card behind it. The words he had left there, not to be read by others, but to say a thing to the paper that paper might obey. If I keep count, they pass clean. If I falter, they knock. He opened his eyes and wrote Martha Cole. He left space for the manor. He set his pen above the line and waited, a surgeon's hand above a pulse that has not yet stopped. The storm provided its own instrument. Somewhere behind the widow's chimney, a joint in old mortar sighed and bore and then forgot how to hold. The house failed the way an old promise fails first in hairline ways, then all at once. He finished the line, head wound. He marked the knot. It went black. 9-12. The bell rope rose in the empty church as if gripped by a careful hand. It did not ring. Not yet. It trembled. The caretaker sat 2 pews back and watched the rope like a snake that might be friendly or might simply be quiet enough to be near. He did not breathe when lightning lit the glass and made the dead saints blink. Rain crowded the doctor's windows. The panes flexed and came back. The sash rattled and settled. The house had learned to take weather the way an old body takes grief. It flinched, then remembered how to go still. He dipped the quill. The ink took longer to climb. 9-30. The road disappeared as a surface and returned as a direction only. Those who had gone out came back to themselves, not their homes. The undertaker's chair shifted an inch under him. He set his hat on the floor and pressed his palms to the line of the door. Feeling for a knock he hoped not to hear Dot in the study. The doctor closed the ledger lightly, not to mark a halt, but to listen to the sound of leather and paper finding each other. A simple closing. A hinge taking its weight. He counted to 7 and opened it again. The page lay obedient. The margins waited like banks on a river that had not yet found its floodplain. He wrote the hour. Between the seconds of the clock, the room stretched. The quill felt like a bone pulled from a wing. He held it too tight. The nib bit a little. The paper said nothing. The book does not encourage or comfort. It receives. He lined his breath to the rain and found his arm could go another hour. 9-40-2. He wrote a 4th name. He did not write his own. There is always a space where the hand refuses honesty. He kept that space bright as a kept tooth. He would not touch it until the hour demanded. Outside, the river climbed the stair of the bank with the deliberation of a man too tired to hurry. It reached the top step and stood a moment considering the house at the edge of the field that leaned a little to the left. It made no show of choosing. It turned and eased into the road instead, a guest who will not be forced. 9-50. The church door breathed and settled. The bell rope relaxed. The caretaker let out a small sound he would have called a laugh if the hour had been any other, and his hand any warmer. 10 o'clock. The doctor lifted the quill for the 5th time. The flame bellied in the glass. The wind took a breath as if to speak a word and thought better. In the pause came clarity, the sharpness that sits on the back of a storm just before it lowers its head and runs. He wrote a name he had not yet learned with his ears. He wrote it as if a mouth at the edge of the page had shaped it for him. He wrote it clean. He wrote it once. He left no room for correction. He blotted Dot in the town. A window opened without hands. A book slid from a shelf and found the floor spine first, as if it had tried to walk out and changed its mind. A cradle rocked once and stood. The mules went quiet. 10-5. The doctor stood for the first time since the lamp was lit. He crossed to the window and pressed his palm to the pane. Cold climbed his bones efficiently. He watched his breath make a milky fog that showed him his own face blurred and gray. He thought of the card hidden in the board and the rule written there. He sat again. He turned to a fresh line. He wrote the sheriff's name. He paused. He left the condition blank. 10:10 p.m. The sound changed pitch. The air in the doctor's room felt like a lung that had forgotten to exhale. Each gust pressed the window panes inward until they bowed like breath against glass. Behind the pressure was something slower, the deep groan of the valley itself, stone shifting underwater. The mine tunnels filled in a single surge. Men sleeping in bunkhouses woke too late to call names. The doctor dipped the quill again. The ink no longer shone black. It glimmered red-brown, as though the bottle had learned blood from memory. He wrote Hiram Bell, the undertaker, and next to it a single note, drowned indoors. He blotted and moved on. The next name waited already formed at the edge of thought. He did not know who whispered it. He knew only that to delay would make the knocking start. 10-15. The church's foundations lifted a finger's breadth and set back down. Ephraim Lot, still in his pew, saw dust fall from the rafters in straight lines, Rain's twin inside the house of God. He said once, to no one, "Count them," and then the bell struck once clean, unsummoned. Lightning followed half a breath later, bright enough to throw his shadow forward and backward at the same time. The doctor heard it. He looked toward the window, but not out. He wrote the caretaker's name. The quill scratched like bone on slate. 10:17. The bell rang twice more. The ledger shook on the desk. Not from thunder, but from the faint vibration of resonance, a tone that found the nails in the walls and made them sing. He set his left hand flat upon the page to steady it. The pulse under his palm matched the ringing. He counted the beats. 7, always 7. When the third toll died, the storm exhaled. The valley filled with the absence of sound, a gap so wide the mind sought to mend it. In that silence, water and wind seemed to listen back. He thought of the phrase that had lived in his family longer than any bloodline. When the hand fails, the name will suffice. He felt the weight of that rule in the wrist. The ache that meant another was due. He wrote the 7th entry. The page absorbed it without shine, as though the paper had waited its whole life for that line. 10:21. The lamp faltered, the last of the oil gone. He worked by lightning now, each flash a frame of motion. Pen above paper, ink on skin, the shadow of a man already half erased by light. The thunder followed slower, reluctant, as if it had to climb uphill to find him. Outside, the river unspooled across the main road and wrapped the church steps in a gray scarf. The mules were gone. Roof shingles spun like leaves. The houses nearest the water turned with the current and drifted in pieces. Yet the doctor's house stood its angle wrong, but its heart unbroken. 10:30. A shape moved on the porch. He did not look. He felt it through the floor. A weight that tested the boards, paused, withdrew. Rain hissed along the roof, found the chimney, fell inside like coins into a well. He wrote the time beside the sheriff's name. Still he left the condition blank. There are truths a man cannot write about another until he has written them about himself. 10-40. He turned the page. The spine of the book crackled. Somewhere within, a seam of glue parted like old flesh. Beneath the desk, the floor trembled again, and a single nail rose out of the plank as if pushed from below. The house shifted. The doctor took the movement for a sign and wrote his own name. Elias Wren, M.D. He hesitated at the final line. He began to write expired and stopped halfway through the second letter. The quill hung, dripping dot. The storm spoke through the chimney, one long descending note. It filled the room the way air fills a lung before speech. He listened. In that note lived every voice he had ever recorded. He set the quill down. The word remained unfinished. He closed the ledger. 10-40-5. The house groaned once more, a sound like an oar biting water. The lamp died for good. He lifted the book, pressed it to his chest, and walked to the door. When he opened it, rain entered as though it had been waiting politely. He stepped into the floodlight of lightning and did not raise a hand to shield his face. From the road, the last witness, a miner named Isaac Thorne, saw a man's silhouette standing on the porch, hallowed in white fire. In one flash, the figure turned down the steps. In the next, it was gone. The flood took the rest. The ledger drifted for a while before settling against the roots of a pine. It closed itself. The storm moved on. By midnight, Black Hollow had ceased to exist as a town and become a single broad scar of mud. The church bell hung crooked. The post office clock stopped at 10:17. The sheriff's house stood empty, the door open, the chair overturned, the key still in the lock. And in the open ledger, 7 lines ended in the same word, ink blacker than the night that made it. At dawn, the rain withdrew, leaving the river to count what remained. It found the book first. The brass corners shone once in the new sun, and then the mud closed over them. A thin chorus of morning insects, no birds, only wind moving through what used to be walls. The storm was over, but its echo would go on for another 100 years. There are storms that flatten towns and storms that flatten memory. Black Hollow suffered both. The river washed away the bodies, but the book washed away days. Dates loosened from recollection and drifted off like leaves. The survivors spoke around the facts, and their children learned to skirt the name as they would a sinkhole in pasture. So the town went down twice, once in water, once in silence. But the ledger did not drown. Objects built to endure will find a shore. It turned up again and again where rules were kept. First the church cellar, then the courthouse, then the state. It traveled on signatures. It learned the back doors of basements, the unlabeled cabinets, the habit of clerks to tuck what disturbs into drawers and call it a later problem. A later problem becomes an heirloom. In the years after the storm, people spoke of small knockings at odd hours, 3 soft touches, as if a gloved hand sought permission to enter. The knocks came whether a door existed or not. A widow in a canvas tent by the river heard them at the seam where canvas met dirt. A miner lodging in a borrowed barn heard them in the floorboards beneath straw. A child heard them at the headboard and kept her eyes shut until light. The knockers did not wait long. If no one answered, the sound withdrew to the edge of hearing. A polite retreat that left behind the sense of a guest still in the yard. 7 years on, a freshet came through the valley, small compared to the night that named the town. Nothing fell. But the bell rope in the ruined church rose once, strained and settled. That night, in a ledger far from the valley, a parish record. In Virginia, a clerk found a line he did not write, a name not in his flock, ink of a shade he did not own. He scratched it out, but the next page bore the same hand. Names migrate. Books speak among themselves. In homes hung with calendars, and in rooms without any patterns returned. The rule of 7 surfaced in places that had never heard of Black Hollow, the 7th month bringing a stillness to chickens. The 7th step on a staircase making a bowed sound. The 7th photograph in a stack developing with a gray blur at the edge, like a thumb that was not there. People called it superstition and went on. But superstition is only a name for a pattern seen from the wrong end. Decades ground the valley into ore and story. Hunters found the church steps under sumac. Children dared each other to spend a night among the tilted stones. And in the morning, none of them spoke about the hour between 3 and 4 when the cold wore teeth. Half a century passed. The river widened its bed by a hand's breadth and then stopped, satisfied. The mountain resumed its slow breathing. The surface quieted. The depths did not. Elsewhere, the ledger served its purpose with the patience of a tide. In Raleigh, the object remained mislabeled for a generation, inhabiting the bottom shelf of a room that hummed with a faint, dry electricity. The humming came from nowhere and everywhere, the noise of paper in company with its own kind. The staff joked about the cold spot in Sub-Archive B1. The joke grew old. New staff stopped going down alone. An archivist older now, though he refused to measure the years, avoided speaking the name of the book that had followed him out of the county and into the state's keeping. He learned the patterns of the building instead. Which elevator to take when the rain began. Which switch to leave off to keep the hum from resolving into words. He never touched the ledger again. He did not need to. It had touched everything else. Sometimes, late, a box on the 7th shelf slid a fraction closer to the edge. Once, a tag came unstrung and fell. He read it without meaning to. The tag bore no object number. It bore only a word. Balance. He set it back. It was gone the next day, exchanged for another identical, as if the room kept a stack for him to find and return, each time a courtesy. Far from the museum, the law continued its arithmetic. A county clerk in Tennessee entered a coroner's list on a winter morning and found, in his own hand, 2 names interleaved he did not recall. He struck them. They reappeared on the index, page under a column he had never created, unclaimed to be written. He shut the book and pressed his palms to the cover until the skin of his hands chilled. When he opened it, the column had gone, but a small seed-shaped smile of stain remained near the spine. A private joke between papers. The haunting found other mediums. In an office with no books at all, a server registered an access by a credential long retired. E. Wren. The entry appeared on every seventh line of the log for a single minute at 10:17 p.m. The technician copied the log to show a supervisor. The copied file contained no such anomaly. He printed it. The printed paper showed it again. Ink remembers what pixels forget. Stories persisted, because stories are the opposite of drowning. In mountain kitchens, women recited a rhyme to keep babies quiet when the wind built from the west. If the bell rings 1, put the kettle on. If it rings 2, mind your shoe. If it rings 3, lock the door and let it be. No one could say where the rhyme began, only that it worked if said softly in a room without mirrors. Someone laughed at the notion of mirrors, but no one the rhyme belonged to hung one. And yet, despite rhyme and rule, despite the cleverness of renaming what frightens the ledger, kept its own clock. Each November, something in the air arranged itself into attentiveness. At 10:17, the town that was no longer a town listened, and so did the rooms where the book had rested. The listening is the first step. The second is the writing. The third is the balance settling like silt. One must pass to reach the next. On an unremarkable January snow thin to lace on weeds, a sky the color of slurry, the archivist went back to Black Hollow. He told himself it was for a photograph, for context in a publication he would never finish. He parked where the road sank into the river and walked in along a spine of pebbles left by last spring's retreat. The air smelled of iron and thawed moss and old nails. He moved as one walks through a sleeping house, careful with the floor he could not see. The church steps rose from weeds like an idea returning. He climbed them. The doorway held nothing. He stood where the bell rope would have fallen and felt, not a draft, but a narrow absence of air, as if a cord had lifted a volume of the room and not yet let it drop. He looked for traces and found the small, faithful evidence his ruin keeps, the iron ghost where a hinge once was, the rust print of a cross on plaster long degraded to sift, the underline where a pew's edge stained the floorboard darker. He did not speak. He did not bring a recorder. He brought a notebook as habit brings what the hand expects. He wrote the date in the corner and waited for the rest. It did not come. Patience then. He put away the book. He went down into the grass. He followed the path any water would make. At the bend where the river turned toward the highway, he found the place where 3 black pines had once stood. 2 remained, older than any trouble. Between them lay a rectangle of fieldstone, sunk and heaved and resunk the family plot, or the garden or the gash. He knelt with care and set his palm to the soil. The ground gave back a degree of warmth above the airs. He pulled his hand away. The warmth did not leave his skin. He did not dig. He had promised himself that once, and promises to the dead are still binding if you whisper them low enough. He stood and faced the river, and the river, that old counter, breathed up a fog that tasted of tin roofs and pennies and coinage rubbed thin. The breath he took moved something in the weeds. A glass throat winked, the neck of a vial, smoothed by time. He had seen its kind before, on a porch rail in a house that did not exist now, strung with others to ring against each other when wind came. He bent, reached, hesitated, left it. Some bells never want the tongue returned. Evening came earlier than it should have for that latitude, for that month. The trees dressed in shadow. The snow lost its light. He looked at his watch without seeing the hands. He knew what hour it was by the feeling in the ribs, the way the body counts for you when you would rather be poor at numbers. He turned toward the car. The first knock came at the seam of canvas. Not his, but a memory of knocks stitched to the place. The second came from the wooden stile that once crossed a fence no longer there. The third came from exactly nowhere, 3 mild touches pressed into air as into cloth, asking as always for permission. He did not answer. He knew the rule, but rules bind the obedient and the disobedient alike. The road out wore 7 small gullies cut across it by last week's thaw. He measured them with the old, artificial care of a man who wants no room for an accident to say it found him. At the 4th, the car hesitated and then climbed. At the 6th, the tail swung a little and the world showed him the river where he had hoped to see trees. At the 7th, the hood dipped as into a bow. He eased the wheel. He did not look into the rearview mirror. He did not need to. Behind him, the church steps had learned again how to hold the air to the shape of a rope. He drove on. The town, no longer a town, let him go the way a hand lets go a name reluctantly, then all at once. He reached the highway while daylight still pretended at evening. He did not look back. The mountain prefers it that way. Morning never came clean to that valley. It leaked in by inches, a gray that could not decide between light and smoke. The archivist reached home before the sun had chosen a color. He locked the car, placed his notebook on the kitchen table, and waited for the world to resume its ordinary wait. It never quite did. He washed his hands 3 times. The warmth from the soil at Black Hollow lingered through the water. He wrote nothing that day. He meant to, but each page of his notebook already bore faint indentations, shallow and narrow, as if written from below. He turned one page, then another, and saw words that were not his forming like frost. Name, condition. Expired. He closed the book. The air in the room thickened the heaviness of paper drawing breath. From somewhere beyond the walls came the dull rhythm of a bell, not iron but memory, striking 3 times. He counted without meaning to. 7 breaths between each note. At 10:17, the lamp flickered. The clock on the mantel stopped. The sound that replaced ticking was the low scrape of a quill on parchment. He rose, walked to the study door, and did not open it. Some sounds must remain on the other side. Outside, wind pressed against the shutters. It carried a smell of wet pine and iron, of old storms. He told himself it was only weather, but when he turned the handle to test the latch, his palm came away black with ink. He slept in the chair by the window. In the dream that followed, the mountains bent low enough to whisper. They said the same thing in every tongue the dead have ever learned. Keep count. He woke with the phrase between his teeth. The notebook on his lap lay open to a new page. On it, in his own hand, was the line he had sworn never to write. Elias Wren condition, unresolved. The ink was still wet. He left the house before dawn. No one saw him after. A week later, neighbors found the door unlatched, the lamp cold, and on the table a closed notebook, brass corners faintly green with age. It was heavier than a notebook should be. Inside, the first entry read, Archivist, unnamed. Duty resumed. Below it, 7 blank lines waited. The book remains unclaimed in the State Archive. Curators change, clocks are replaced. Yet once a year, when the barometer dips and thunder rehearses itself over the ridge, the cameras in Sub-Archive B1 record the same thing. At 10:17 p.m., the humidity falls to 0, the temperature drops to the memory of snow, and one volume shifts half an inch forward, as if to be counted. No one touches it now. They have learned the rule. Still, if you ever walk those halls and hear the soft turning of a page in a room you thought was sealed, do not look in. Listening is already enough, because stories are ledgers too, and the telling is a kind of ink. Every name written in breath will one day balance itself in silence. The doctor understood this first. The archivist only confirmed it. The rest of us will, in time.